I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. Bobbie Woodward is going to be in conversation with Barbara Lusk, and I have to say, Bobbie was a foundation member of WRPS, and I just wanted to read you something. She's been a committee member on WRPS as well. She was the secretary, and I want to read you something from our history book, the history of society. This is what Bobbie wrote. I was not very enlightened about swamps in those early days, but was very concerned for the health of the Tehenga Lagoon, where I and my siblings and later my own children, nieces and nephews had gained confidence in the water and started to learn to swim. A motley steering committee, that was WRPS, was formed, including myself, and was charged with getting the society started. Very soon, a regular committee was formed, the name chosen, and after the success of the landfill protests, instead of simply winding the society up, the society went on to address other issues threatening the rangers. And it says, Bobbie was a prime mover in getting people interested in an issue and motivating them. He spent many days and evenings ringing and calling people who she knew. Some of those people were Sir Harcourt Towie, who was our first patron, Lucy Cranville, who was a patron of the society, John Morton, who was a patron of the society. These are all friends of yours. And on it goes. So I'm not going to go any further, but Bobbie has written quite a few books about the Waitakere Ranges, but the most recent book called Shimmer Sea is a wonderful read about a wonderful life. And, so I asked her and I thought she'll say no. She said yes, so thank you. So Bobbie and Barbara, we're looking forward to hearing.
Right.
Yourself, yep.
Well, thank you, John. And I'm sure our conversation will go well, but whether the technology will cope with the technology, we don't know. But Captain Marvel over there will be on the job. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to have this interview with Bobbie. It's a conversation more than a question and answer. Bobbie and I have known each other for about 50 years. Mm-hmm. And in that time, we've holidayed together, we've socialised together, we've tramped together, we've partied together, we've had lots of discussions on politics and environment, all sorts of things. It's been a privilege for me to get to know her so well. She's an amazing woman. I know she'll hate me saying this, but she knows literature, she knows theatre, she knows music, she can hear a classical piece playing and she'll know who composed it and when it was and what the piece was. As well as that, she's a gutsy advocate for all sorts of causes. Am I embarrassing you yet or not?
Well, you did about the music, because I don't always know what it was. I might guess,
She's an advocate for justice and environment, climate change. Even tonight, when we were having dinner together, she was strategizing about how we could get more action on climate change. She is a treasure. She is a treasure for the Waitakere Ranges, and she's a treasure for those who know her. Over the years that I've known her, I learnt about lots of things about her life, but there were some details of her life which she wouldn't talk about. On the sideboard in her beautiful little house, Shimmer Sea, there was a photo. I knew she'd been Miss New Zealand way back, and there was a photo on the sideboard of Bobbie with the Queen. And whenever I tried to open up the conversation about being Miss New Zealand, it was just a no-go area. Don't go there. I don't want to talk about it. So instead, she's written a book which has got the title, Whatever Happened to Miss New Zealand 1949. So at last, it's out in the open. And what an amazing journey your life's been. From that to now, sitting here at the AGM of the Waitakere Rangers. It's had highs, it's had lows. So we're not going to answer questions about details of her life, which are all in the book. It's the questions that I'm going to ask her, the conversation we're going to have, is more about motivation, why she wrote the book, how she coped with the highs and the lows in her life, and finally, her love of Te Hinga, the wild west coast, the landscape of her heart. That wonderful landscape that we both just adore. There'll be time for questions afterwards, but Bobbie, it's your turn now. I've done all the talking. So let's start first with the reluctant. Why were you reluctant to talk about being Miss New Zealand? Because there's certainly, it was a total reluctance.
Well, Barb, wouldn't you be reluctant if there was a picture of you like that? That was taken at a mayoral reception, I think, in Wellington. There was another one in Auckland and yet another one in New Plymouth. And they all had these terrible photographs, really, of crowds of people. I don't know how the people got there or why they got there, except that the people that were organising this thing had a lot of power and they wanted to screw every ounce of publicity out of it. And so, but 7 years ago, Barb, no, that's the wrong thing to say. 7 years before I came to live in Titirangi, I was really, I'd been Miss New Zealand 7 years earlier, and I really wanted, people didn't seem to want to move on. You know, I think a lot of people too thought it had been a bathing beauty, and they looked at me and their faces fell, because I never was a bathing beauty, never went in a bathing suit, anything like that. But still, people seemed to expect something of me, and I was sick of it after 7 years of putting up with that. And so I really refused to talk about it. You know, I was living in a little shack in Titirangi on 10 acres of bush that my husband and I had just bought. It was covered in gorse and big old pine trees, and I had 3 little babies, no car. My only social activity was at the play centre and my children's activities, but I was happy there. It felt authentic, and I really wanted to put all that other thing behind me, and I think I managed. Now, I had a very good lesson in authenticity. Hang on, I think there's another one of these wretched pictures. Yes, there it is. Have a look and we'll move on. I had a real mentor in authenticity in this lady called Lucy Mendel-Stonnell, who taught me to dance, but she taught me many other things as well. She was a great influence in me. Now, she lived in quite a lot of poverty and disorder. She'd come from a very, very wealthy family, but now the Nazis, due to the Nazi, of course, the family fortunes had all dried away. And she got about New Plymouth in the most terribly battered old car. And she never worried what she looked like. But she had, as far as I was concerned, she stood for everything that I admired. So I learned the lesson then. What's on the outside is not a true representation of what's on the inside, very often. And Lucy was that. And I wanted to be authentic.
Is it time for a second question?
Yes, yes.
Well, Shimasi was launched on your 90th birthday, and usually as people approach that age, they just want to slow down, put their feet up and let the world go by. But you decided to write this book, so what was the motivation?
Well, I'd done a lot of writing for an organisation called No Ordinary Life, and I enjoyed writing. I'd also written widely about both my maternal and my paternal families, and doing that I got to know them very well through reading about them mostly, and finding what things I had in common with those people who were my relatives, or had come before me. And I had the feeling that belonging to a big family group is very important. I think it's very important for us to know where we belong, to have roots. And I wanted my children to have the same. So I wrote about my own life. You know, your kids don't ask you about things. I gave it to them in that.
So tell me a bit about how you arrived at the title for the book, Shimmersea.
Well, I lost my home in 1979 and planned to build another little one to replace it. And my goodness, we have to go on to this, sorry. Oh, pressed the wrong thing. There we are. That's the title, the book cover. And, oh, that's a photograph that was inside the cover. I'm at the BBC and sending a message back to New Zealand, I think. Right. How did I get the title, you're asking me? Well, my son, who was also a writer, had maps of the places that he had written about. And one time I was looking at one of these maps and I saw the name Shimmersea, and I thought that would be a good name for my little house, because it looks down over the shimmering sea of the Manukau Harbour. So that's how I got that name.
Right.
There's a few more photos, I think, here. Yes, that's the little house.
Beautiful
Not
little
a very
house.
good photograph of it, but I had a bit of a battle with... I've got so many photos. That is the photograph taken by Mark Smith just on entering the house. And that's the interior. Too many paintings, but it is an interior that I love, and I don't mind that I've got paintings. I'll start putting them on the ceiling next. And, oh yes, this portrait was one that was done for me when I was in England on this New Zealand tour by a very famous painter, and that portrait hangs in the hall of my little house, along with portraits of my children.
Right, can I return you, you right? Can I move on?
Yes, certainly.
Right. Can I return you to Miss New Zealand? I was watching The Crown a couple of years ago with Bobbie and John and another friend, and suddenly Bobbie started talking about being Miss New Zealand in a way, because people in The Crown were people that she met back in 1949. So the conversation for the first time ever, it was the first time we'd ever had a conversation about Miss New Zealand. So you were a 21-year-old, and the conversation that night just showed what a high-profile, high-octane life it was for 3 months over in the United Kingdom. It was meeting Lord Mayors, it was meeting councillors, it was meeting famous people.
Dukes
so
and duchesses.
you were Dukes and Duchesses, spending the day with the Princess...
Oh yes, the Princess Royal.
Princess Royal, and talking gardening with her. So you were 21 years old. How many 21-year-olds could cope with an existence like that? High-profile existence. So Bobbie, how did you cope with it?
Well, it was a terrible shock to win this thing, because I'd really got into it by a mistake and then I couldn't get out. And then when I found I'd won it, I simply, well, you know, I had to go through with it. I actually acted the part, and I think I acted it reasonably well. I had 3, well, more like 4 months really in Britain. The host organisation was the Royal Air Force Association, which is a very, very powerful organisation, and they were going to use me for publicity. My touring in Britain took me from Land's End in this very south, to John O'Groats in the north, also to Ulster, and a week in Paris, visiting branches of the Royal Air Force Association.
Should you be
Yes, I should be clicking
technologies?
Yes, that's right. It just gets away with me. Yes, my function there was to be the focus for meetings, social meetings of all sorts, from morning coffee get-togethers to perhaps grand balls, at many of these Royal Air Force Association groupings. The idea was that people bringing in ex-servicemen, ex-service personnel, bringing them together for a good time helped to revive that spirit of camaraderie that they'd had during the war, and quite frankly was running, was running pretty thin after the war, when Britain went through quite a bad depression and many people were without work. So that was my function, to meet all these people and be gracious and welcoming and talk about their, and so many people said to me things like, "Oh, do you know Billy Burke from Ekatahuna?" sort of thing. Now, the publicity started when a group of New Zealand Sea Scouts met me at Heathrow and did a haka, which, of course, the publicity for that was terrific, and it was in every paper virtually, even the conservative ones in the British press. This was the hongi that started it all off. And I just run through, not only meeting these people, ex-RAF members, but I visited every industrial area. I would visit the prime industry that was, whether it was, in this case, coal mining in the Midlands, but it was carpet making in the west, hosiery in the Midlands, pottery in the north, this sort of thing. And the next one is, there were great adventures. This man was a test pilot for Hawker aircraft, and he took me up in the fastest fighter at the time, which was called a Sea Fury, and we flew over London and dive-bombed, and he gave me the controls for a while, and it was very exciting. But was I pleased to get my feet on the ground, because at the luncheon before, with the Hawker people, he'd had a few drinks. So, I visited many hospitals. That was part of it. Now, this was a pleasant time because so many of the people I had to meet and talk to were older. They'd been through the war, they were heavy smokers, This group of young men on the Thames, on the vessel, the naval vessel Bridlington, which was part of the RAF, obviously had boats as well. And what was the next one? I think there was another one. I'm giving you very few of the hundreds of photographs that I had of the trip. Yeah, now that was laying a wreath on a RAF memorial, and it was the only time that my small height gave me any real problems. I had to reach up. Now, what on
do you want me to?
Oh yes, no, that's. Oh, I didn't tell you that Roots Group, a very prominent automobile firm, lent me a Humber Pullman for my time in the UK, complete with a lovely chauffeur, Brown. We were great friends with him. And I went around doing tours at all these different parts of the UK with my chaperone and a publicity manager from the Royal Air Force Association. So we had a lot of fun. I think that's it.
Okay.
Let's go on.
So all that when she was 21. I wonder how many other 21-year-olds could have coped with a life like that in the limelight. Now, after a few years, you returned, you met Peter and married, and the first of your 4 children was born. In fact, you had 3 children, as you say, in a very small house in Titirangi, in the bush, with no car, no money. So how did you do that transition from that high-flying, almost like a film star life, to being a mother?
Oh, I was terribly relieved to be through with it. And that's what I've said earlier. I moved on very quickly. It's just that the rest of the world didn't move on quite so quickly, kept reminding me about it. Now, I've married shortly after that, and I went off with my husband to Britain, where for him to complete his medical training, and I met a lot of the people. Of course, I revisited so many of the people and places that I'd known earlier. It was a lovely time.
So it looks like we're moving on to Te Henga.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I did click that
beautiful
a little
photo
prematurely.
of Te Henga, an old man's head at the end of it. You obviously have a great love for the coast. So what's changed since you first went there? When did you first go there?
Oh, well, Te Henga is our tūranga waiwai to our family. We all, my grandfather, Pa Bethel, owned the farm behind the beach, and that is how it got its name, Bethel's Beach. Mind you, my family never say Bethel's Beach. It's always the Maori name, Te Henga. I really don't like hearing it called Bethel's Beach very much. However, Pa Bethel, who was by this time retired, and his son Frank was farming, but Pa gave my mother a little cottage near the sea at Te Henga, because this was for her use when the family came back from Samoa, where my father had a position and most of my family siblings were born there. So we used to come every 2 years to the little cottage. And from then on, once we left Samoa and lived in New Zealand, we came up every summer for the summer holidays. And now that cottage has been used by 5 generations of my family, the last ones, little children. This is one of Mark Smith's beautiful photographs of the beach.
Can you talk? Oh, sorry.
I wanted to show you, yes, this was the cottage. That would have been in the 1930s. There's very little growth around it. Now there's even a kauri tree growing in the front yard now. And another photograph of the cottage, which I love. The cottage at night, brilliant photograph again by Mark Smith. So that's where my family is lucky enough to have a little cottage. We own the cottage, we don't own the land, so however long it lasts.
You've told me over the years how people got out to Te Henga. So it's not like it is today with sealed roads all the way and bridges. So what are some of the ways in which people would access the beach?
Yeah, just before we moved on, I wanted to say that it was really my love of the Te Henga that got me involved with helping to form the Waitakere Rangers Protection Society, because when council decided that they were going to put a rubbish dump in the Waitakere Valley, of course, you know, my sister and I, Dave, Harry, 1 or 2 others, we called a meeting, and that was it. So and that was really getting me into environmental work. And from then on, I have done environmental work sort of, you know, all over the place, really, mostly in West Auckland, though. Sorry, Barb, now you asked me about the changes.
The changes, how people used to get out to Te Henga.
Yes. Well, we'll just have to go through a few photos because this was a photograph taken of me at a working bee I think we were planting trees in a rubbish dump in Te Atatu. Oh, there's Dave Harris' car. Pulverise the tip proposal. Save the Waitakeres. Oh, and this is the photograph of the bulldozer, the tug of war between the bulldozer and the people. It's really symbolic of bureaucracy against the human being, I think. So what have we got next? This will be a bit of a surprise. Oh, yes, I don't do environmental work these days. You know, I haven't really got the muscles for it. I've transferred my loyalty to working for peace and non-violence because I'm a Quaker, and that's what they stand for. So this, I was down there in a, I was making tea instead of war. That's what that was about. Now let's see what happens next, Barb. Oh, no, we'll go back. I don't think we're going to worry about this one. Okay, now you're asking me about the changes. Well, the scenery at the coast at Te Hinga has changed remarkably over the years. When I first knew it, well, it must have been very tiny, because you couldn't get to the cottage except by going along the beach, because there was no way. There was, you know, we all know that Te Hinga is sand dunes all the way along. At the north end, the sand dunes stretched right back and joined up with the Wainamu sand dunes. So it was a huge area of shifting sand. You look at it now, it's all roaded. There's beach cottages and some permanent homes. There's Jim's Cafe and the whole subdivision there, the surf club. None of that would have been possible except for a very ambitious project that took place in the 1940s, late 1940s, of planting marram on that shifting sand. My uncle Frank had planted marram along the south end of the beach earlier, many years earlier, to stabilise the sand enough so that they could make a road up to their homestead. But this other was a much bigger project than that. We'd go out every weekend over 3 years, mostly in the winter, of course, and plant marram, and it was a really lovely thing to do. We all had a great time there. Yes. My mother, of course, remembers that the problem about, you see, Pa Bethel and then his son, and Frank and Gert, his son and daughter-in-law, who came after him, they wanted to share the beauty of where they lived with people, so they set up an accommodation service over the summer. So they had to get these visitors with their luggage from Waitakere station to the homestead. And my mother remembers in the early days that, of course, it was a draft horse pulling a sledge which carried the luggage, the people walking behind. And it had to go down the river to the sea, then along the beach at low tide and up this track that had been formed earlier. Then the next thing, when cars came in, of course, we could take cars along the beach at low tide. But what the next big development really was when the Model A's with big balloon tyres, a Model A was bought and the guests were transferred into that near the sandhills, and the Model A went across the sand. Mind you, it often got stuck, and then there'd be calls for help. The number of times I've helped push or dig the Model A out of that sand is just legion, really. Yes. Yes, my sister and I used to, Ibby, some of you will remember Elizabeth Wheeler. We, when we were students up in Auckland, we'd often take a train to Waitakere and walk out, or really run, really. It's only 7 miles, and we soon got there. We never took much food with us, perhaps a bottle of milk and a loaf of bread, because we knew there was mussels on the rocks and fish in the sea. There wasn't electricity at that time. The electricity didn't come till the 1950s. That's 60 years ago.
So, Bobbie, is there anything else you want to say before we move on to your last?
Well, I would like to just say that although the access to the accommodation house has always been a great problem, but it's now solved, of course, because of the work that we did on that marram planting. But that was for so long problematical. Now, what I feel about the area is a sense of great hope for its future, because so many now of people who live in the Waitakere Valley and at Te Hanga itself are keen to work for the land, to plant trees, get rid of the rubbish, get rid of the pest plants, and I think that it's all on the way up out there. The community spirit has really impressed me very much. And of course now, what used to be seen as, you know, a beach with dirty black sand and very violent waves, and avoided for people who would prefer to go to the East Coast beaches, now of course it's a magnificent something that I think is probably recognised worldwide through the reach of film, and I think we can be very grateful that we have access to this place of most wonderful scenery, where we can see nature working its own plans out. I mean, the sand build-up. No one knows what the sand's going to do out there. There's the whole geology of the place. It's a most interesting and wonderful area, and I'm so grateful that I've had access to it throughout my life. Yes, I think.
So I think we've probably got time just quickly to talk about your time in Iran.
All right.
Given especially the events of the last week.
Yes, well, my daughter fell in love with an Iranian, beautiful man. He came to New Zealand and lived here for a while, and then he decided that he needed to go back to Iran and see how his parents were getting on, because the great Iranian Revolution had taken place. So he was back in Iran and my daughter was in New Zealand, but she was determined to go. So she went over, met him again, they got to know each other, and the next thing I knew, they were going to marry. So what could you do except try hard to get a visa for Iran? It wasn't easy at that time, but I managed, and I went over. It was a very difficult time to go post-revolution. The strictures on what you could do and not do were very, very, very heavy, and the penalties were vast, I think, even for somebody like myself who didn't belong there. So this picture I had is of the family on the New Year's resolution that comes at the end of March in their calendar, and this just shows how the Iranians love to go out into the bush, into the wilderness, and have picnics. And this was one of them. I was so lucky to be taken right into the heart of a very large Iranian family, and I knew them all, from the oldest to the babies that were being born. You know, I was part of that family for 6 months. And it was the most wonderful experience. What I found there was that Iranians, Muslims, are really just like us. You've got all sorts. There was the odd one who would be very pernickety about the right thing, doing the right thing at the right time of day. And I remember almost stumbling over somebody. We were at a picnic, and there was this person down on the ground, and I thought, well, what's he doing there? And then I realised, of course, he was doing his prayers. Others would take it all quite lightly, as we perhaps take our Christianity in the West. The only time I saw any people get really worked up about their religion was at the time, the celebration of the death of Ali, the murder of Ali actually, which took place 1500 years ago, and they're still going on about it. And that is what keeps the Sunni-Shia rift going. And this is one thing that I really find intolerable about it. But apart from that one time of violence, when the young men go out on the street and beat themselves to bring the blood in remembering the martyrdom of Ali, it was a wonderful experience and full of love and recognition of me I was seen as a Christian pilgrim and given quite honourable reception. So I think that's...
So I think covering all that, you can see that she's gutsy, she's courageous, she has had the most amazing life. Bobbie, you are a treasure.
Well, thank you. A taonga?
A taonga.
No, I don't think so.
Now, there might be some questions, so please, we have a few minutes left.
I'd like to ask, there was a very good bit in the book, Shimasi. After you had been around for quite some time, you realised that your visa had expired. And you had to leave. But you didn't just get on a plane and come straight back to New Zealand. You did a most remarkable thing.
Yeah.
You went to Turkey? Did you go to
Greece, yes.
All by yourself?
Yes, and then to Japan.
And then to Japan. I thought that was absolutely remarkable.
Yeah. Well, it was rather funny, this business of being an overstayer in a country that not many people would have wanted to go to anyway at that time. But my son-in-law every month he'd take my visa into the local immigrant's office and have it stamped, and, you know, he just continued. But the bureaucracy, the state of the bureaucracy in that country was so terrible at the time that somebody got it wrong and kept stamping the thing, and I was happy to stay on as long. And all of a sudden I get this, my son-in-law gets this summons for me, had to appear in court, pay a fine, and was shipped out on their next plane into Turkey. And yes, then I had a lovely roam around with a pack on my back, youth hostels. But you know, you meet people all the time and move on with new companions.
Bob.
Mary, can I ask you about the Waitakere River? Because you're probably the last living person that can remember what it was like. How vast was that river? Because it seemed to have ceased. It's the largest wetland in the Auckland region. What was it like? Was it as vast as they say it was? Can you remember?
Well, it was vast, but it was all clear, you know, it's all now. It's got all that bulrush, I suppose, growing in it. And no, I don't really remember it being bigger than it is now, but it was clear, so it did seem to stretch, yes.
That's before they put the Waitakere Dam.
Well, now, what year did they put that in? Bob, I think you're thinking I'm older than I am.
I think it was in about 1929.
Yes, well, I was born in 1928, so I...
Before that,
Oh, you naughty man.
Thanks. It fascinates me how big it was. It isn't now.
Yes, of course, yeah.
I'm just curious, not to pry, but so your daughter and son-in-law, they stayed on in Iran at that time?
Yes, they did stay on for a while, but my
This is a question just about Bobbie's daughter and son-in-law, just so people can hear what the question was. Sorry, Bobbie.
Yes, well, my daughter she became very depressed by the war with Iraq was on, And every time we went up to the village to do some shopping, there were new photos of the martyrs up in the shops, and there was a great feeling of sorrow throughout the land. Once a week, the lorries bearing the martyrs' bodies all the shops would shut, everyone would be quiet for a time. And Hannah not only got rather depressed about it, but her health suffered. So they decided to come back to this part of the world.
And they live in New Zealand
No,
now?
they went to Australia. And my son-in-law, who had been training in IT, a very a clever man, he became the top vacuum cleaner seller for the whole of Australia in about 1 month or something. Mind you, he didn't stay in that. He got into his own business. But unfortunately, my daughter died at the age of 34 from breast cancer. She was in Australia. Yes. And I've written... She wrote a book about her time in Iran, didn't complete it, and because I'd been there for 6 or 7 months, I was able to complete this book and had it published with Shoal Bay. That was called The Scent of Rosewater. It's about Iran.
Beautiful book.
Thank you very much.
If there are no more questions, John, can we close off, do you think?
Oh!
Oh!
Oh! No, I wasn't going to show you this. No, there you are. No, that was nothing to do with it. That was on board ship going over to England with my husband. But you'll like this next one, I think. That's me last year. Different red bathing suit. Same body. Now, can I just turn it off altogether? I think I want that gone. It won't go.
It won't go.
Okay.
Well, I think you'll all agree it's a remarkable life that Bobbie's led, and I'm glad you're still here to tell us about it. It's been, a real honour. And when I rang Bobbie, I thought she'd say, no, I'm not going to do it. But she said, no, I think I could do it,
You were a bit pressing, John.
But it's been wonderful, remarkable life, thank you. And we'd like to give you both a small gift. Anna, just down the back there.
Pass me that. And we can perhaps go
Turn it
backwards.
off. What? You want to go backwards?
Trying to go backwards.
Oh, no, don't. I don't want that. Come on. We'll have the modern one. The modern version.
Oh, thank you. Oh,
Thank you, Anna. Thank you,
Anna.
Yes. Oh, great.
it's a pleasure.
Oh, goodness me.
Well, please join with me in thanking Bobbie and